The Sega Dreamcast was released in 1998 at a time when Sega's competitors were still in the midst of the fifth console generation and were looking to bring the Nintendo DS and PlayStation to the end consumer. Although Sega was also in the race with the Saturn at the time, the console was far surpassed by both Nintendo and Sony, prompting Sega to launch the new generation as a pioneer and excite audiences with the Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm did not last long, as Sega ceased production of the Sega Dreamcast in 2001 and also completely withdrew from the hardware business. What had happened? Why did the Sega Dreamcast flop with its nearly 9 million units sold? And why did Sega make the serious decision to stop producing consoles? You will learn the answers to all these questions and much more in this video. Let's get started. At the time of the release of the Sega Dreamcast, Sega had already been in the console business for 18 years and had experienced both highs and lows. Therefore, it is necessary for us to first consider the situation the company was in at the time, so that we can fully understand the extent of the decline of the Sega Dreamcast. So let's leave the release year of the Sega Dreamcast and look back 10 years. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive, thereby launching the fourth console generation. As a competing product to NEC's PC Engine and starting in 1990 against the Super Famicom, the Mega Drive achieved moderate success in Japan, but really took off a year later in the USA as Sega Genesis, before it was released in Europe in 1990. In 2001, under Tom Kalinske, the Mega Drive could. The Sega Genesis sold an impressive 30.75 million units and was also expected to remain the most successful Sega console of all time. In 1994, the Sega Saturn was released as the direct successor to the Mega Drive, during which Sega made several significant mistakes with their release policy that would severely harm the Saturn and later the Sega Dreamcast. Thus, the Sega Saturn was released in a confusing environment, where the system ignored its own products like the 32X and the Sega CD, which Sega of Japan commissioned to bridge the waiting time for the Saturn. But I don't want to go into detail about this, as I have already done so in my Saturn video. The Sega Saturn was a complete counterpart to the Mega Drive. In Japan, the Hum-bit console was very well received, despite its high selling price and complicated architecture, which made it difficult for developers to create good games. In the West, especially in the USA, Sega's strongest market up to that point, the situation looked very different. Here, the Sega Saturn flopped massively after it was released overnight a full 4 months ahead of the official date, catching both retailers and buyers as well as developers off guard. All of this led to the Sega Saturn being dropped in the West after just 24 months. From 1997 onwards, hardly any titles were released for the console. And when the then CEO of Sega of America, Bernie Stoller, announced at E3 1997 that the Saturn was not Sega's future, the fate of the bit console was sealed. All these circumstances, the failed add-on hardware for the Mega Drive, the confusing company and release policies, as well as the Saturn disaster in the Western world, resulted in growing resentment among Sega fans. Sega experienced a tremendous loss of trust from customers as well as many developers, and had to watch as both groups switched to Sony, where they developed successful titles for the PlayStation and had much more fun with the system. Mildly speaking, things did not look good for Sega in the middle of that year. The sales of the Sega Saturn plummeted, causing enormous financial damage from which Sega would not recover. I discussed this explosive situation in detail in my video about the rise and fall of the Sega Saturn. Anyone who is not familiar with the documentary is welcome to check it out. But let's linger for a moment in 1995, because while Sega of America was preparing for the US launch of the Saturn, people in Japan were already eagerly thinking about the future and working on plans for a Saturn. Secondly, Lockheed Martin, a company that supported Sega with the graphics of the arcade boards for Sega's Model 1 and Model 2 hardware, was responsible for the Sega Saturn project and was primarily focused on the graphics performance. At that time, Lockheed Martin was working on their Real D series of chipsets for Windows-based PCs, and it was rumored that the Sega Saturn II would use the RD chipset as the basis for its graphics processor. However, by the end of the year, doubts arose as Sega became increasingly dissatisfied with the work of Lockheed Martin, who were simultaneously working on the Sega Model 3 arcade board. Model 3, which was originally scheduled to be released at the end of 1995, was postponed to mid-1996, resulting in Sega temporarily losing its competitive advantage in arcades, which was the last straw. Despite several designs that Lockheed Martin presented to Sega throughout the year 1996, after the Saturn deal fell through, Sega entered into a partnership with the graphics manufacturer Nvidia in the same year, whose first graphics card, the NV, was based on Sega Saturn hardware. It was even possible to connect a Saturn controller via a second board. However, Nvidia had considerable difficulty convincing Sega that the further development of their NV technology was the key to success for a successor. Poor sales figures of the NV graphics card confirmed Sega's decision to no longer maintain the deal with Nvidia. Thus, Sega's second attempt also failed, and the search for a new partner started over in 1996. Fortunately, Sega was involved in 3 different ventures in early 96, and when it became apparent to the company that the deals with Lockheed Martin and Nvidia would not bear fruit, they met with Matsushita. Matsushita, then the parent company of Panasonic, owned the promising M hardware in 1996, which they had purchased from an emerging Trip Hawkins when his project seemed unfeasible. The powerful M hardware was intended for use by cheaters in arcade halls before Sega knocked on the door and expressed interest in it. The plan was for Sega-exclusive games to run on the M hardware in arcade halls, and a modified version of it was to conquer the living rooms of gamers as a home console. So, at the beginning of 1996, Sega ordered some dev kits to their own facilities, but unexpectedly, poor performance of the M dev kit and some clashes between different personalities during the joint discussions led Sega to let the deal fall through and distance itself from Matsushita. When details of a potential collaboration leaked to the press, Sega officially stated only that they had exchanged information about the new DVD technology. Attempt number 3 had thus also failed to bring a successor to the Sega Saturn. The poor performance of the Sega Saturn in the West forced Sega to continue reaching out. In the second half of 1996, another opportunity arose as Sega's market share in the West shrank even faster than the Japanese had hoped with the newly released N. At the same time, the PC market was rapidly evolving, with the 2 companies DFX and Videologic at the forefront. In order to compete with Nintendo, Sega approached both PC companies and prompted them to begin work on a successor to the Sega Saturn. In Japan, a prototype with the codename Dural was developed by Videologic, inspired by a fighter from Sega's Virtua Fighter series, while DFX in the USA was working on Black Belt. Sega supported both developments in different ways. Shuichiro Irimajiri sent former IBM engineer Tatsuo Yamamoto to America to assist with the FX in the development of Black Belt. However, when Sega's chief hardware designer Hideki Sato caught wind of this, he joined forces with his team and the developers at Videologic to advance Dural. Both teams followed the same trends and inevitably made similar decisions, which caused great confusion in the gaming press at the time when the first details about a Saturn successor leaked. The first official announcement concerned Project Dural, when Hitachi went public with the information that it intended to manufacture the CPU for the Japanese console. It turned out that it was the Hitachi SH processor architecture, codenamed White Belt, which was to be used in conjunction with the upcoming Power VR Series 2 graphics chips from Videologic in the production of their mainboard. Western media subsequently referred to the Black Belt project and reported that DFX had chosen the Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee graphics technology. In mid-97, Sega even purchased a 16% stake in DFX, presumably as a sign of commitment to the company's efforts. In the meantime, rumors began to circulate in early 97 that the new console would have a 6 or 8 times CD-ROM drive and a built-in modem. Around the same time, there were also rumors about DVD support in the next PlayStation, which made a CD-ROM drive look outdated. Regarding software and the operating system, Sega was actively seeking partnerships at that time and was in discussions with Microsoft, although details are unfortunately not known. At some point, the Black Belt was shown to a limited number of developers and was apparently very well received. Details about this Western bit machine were hard to come by, but perhaps the most important feature of the Black Belt design came to light: its operating system. This was specifically designed to simplify game development for the console. And since Sega's policy at the time emphasized that pure processing power was not as important as an easy-to-develop operating system, one of the many pitfalls with the Sega Saturn, it seemed to you, that this was the right way to go. The system was developed to support the rapid conversion of games to and from the PC, which was also in Microsoft's interest. Furthermore, the Black Belt project was supported by the newly appointed CEO of Sega of America, Bernie Stolar, who had already attempted to discontinue the struggling Sega Saturn in the West. One only needs to remember his famous statement at E3 1997 when he said, "The Saturn is not our future." At the end of 1997, Sega presented potential developers and publishers with the first dev kits of the Dural prototype developed in Japan, which included a demo version of Scud Race. This version even performed better than the original on Sega's Model 3 arcade hardware, which particularly impressed the Japanese leadership of the company, leading to Dural becoming increasingly the focus of the company, even though Black Belt was more popular in the West. The preliminary decision to prioritize the Dural platform took shape at the end of 1997, when Sega informed game developers to use computers with Intel Pentium 2 processors running at 200 MHz and PowerVR graphics cards as the basis for their new developments. In early '98, the Dural project was publicly known as Katana. This occurred at a time when the Sega Saturn was nearing its end in the West. Electronic Arts discontinued its support for the Saturn, and many Western versions of Japanese Saturn games seemed increasingly unlikely. In 2001, a new console was urgently needed, and Sega of Europe even mentioned a release date in 1909. And 90 days after deciding on Yamamoto's Dual project, Sega proposed to use their hardware in an upcoming console. They justified the decision with a quote about a change of heart that led Sega's Hideki Sato to use a PowerVR-based design. To this day, there are conflicting reports about whether the Katana was stronger than the Black Belt or vice versa. Sonic Team and Sega Dreamcast developer Yuji Naka claimed that a port of Sonic Adventure to the PC was impossible, because the Voodoo cards from DFX were significantly less powerful than what was in the Katana console. Of course, DFX claimed the opposite, and although both the DFX and the PowerVR graphics chips represented a significant improvement in performance compared to the competition from Nintendo and Sony, the decision to abandon DFX was met with disappointment in parts of the gaming world, particularly in the USA, and in some cases with discontent. In particular, Electronic Arts, as a longtime partner of Sega, was confused by the decision. The company had invested a lot of money in DFX and could not understand why Sega had chosen to go against Black Belt. This, along with the poor sales of the Sega Saturn, could explain why EA refused to support the Sega Dreamcast. DFX was of course not pleased either and believed that the graphics chip they produced not only met Sega's expectations in terms of size, performance, and cost, but in some cases even exceeded them. Sega's decision against DFX may also be attributed to DFX revealing details and technical specifications of the then-secret Black Belt project when the company announced its initial public offering in April 1997. Sega also exited the deal with an ace up its sleeve, as their investment in DFX allowed them to claim rights to the technology behind the Black Belt project, preventing it from being used by competitors such as Sony. In response, DFX filed a lawsuit for $155 million against Sega and NEC in September. Videologic claimed that they had been misled into believing that their technology would be used, even though a backroom deal had actually been made between the two Japanese companies in the past months. They continued to claim that Sega had withheld confidential material, which Sega naturally denied. The lawsuit was settled in August '98, with Sega paying $10.5 million to DFX out of court. In early 1998, Project Katana was considered groundbreaking in the video game industry, and when Videologic announced more details about their upcoming PowerVR Series 2 graphics chip, revealing that the production costs were only around $99, fans were ecstatic, especially since the technically comparable Sega Model 3 arcade board cost a hefty amount. It seemed that Microsoft would play no role at all in the development of the console. In 1998, Sega announced another development tool codenamed Dragon that was made available to developers, one that was based on Microsoft's Windows CE technology. Originally, Sega and Microsoft believed that Katana could bridge the gap between home PCs and video game consoles. Windows CE was intended to attract developers of Windows games and provide a less intimidating development environment for those who had not previously worked on consoles. For this, Sega and Microsoft worked for 2 years on refining the Dreamcast version of Windows CE. However, as the future would show, the system was not intended to be used particularly often. Compared to the native operating system of the Sega Dreamcast, Windows CE offered very limited flexibility. Numerous Sega executives believed that the native system was faster and more powerful, but the deal helped Microsoft gain a level of knowledge in console development, which would soon assist them with their own Xbox. And then there was the problem with EA, which refused to develop their games for Katana after the DFX debacle and the Saturn flop. Although there were discussions between EA's CEO Larry Probst and Sega's Bernie Stolar, who were even friends, Electronic Arts demanded too many concessions that Sega was unwilling to meet. On the contrary, to counteract the departure of EA, Sega purchased the development studio Visual Concepts for $10 million to create exclusive sports games for their console. And the NFL 2K that was in development made an extremely promising impression. In the first half of 1998, several details about the Katana project and a similar Sega Model 3 arcade successor, the Naomi board, became known. Katana was supposed to offer 4 controller ports and a built-in modem in addition to the already known and quite powerful hardware, allowing buyers to play online with the console. Additionally, Sega announced details about the storage medium. Contrary to the original plan, games were not to be released on CDs. However, DVDs were also not utilized, contrary to expectations. Instead, Sega collaborated with Yamaha on a so-called GD-ROM format, which offered 40% more storage capacity than conventional CDs. Additionally, the 1 GB GD-ROMs were significantly cheaper to produce than the emerging DVD format, which allowed Sega to maintain the promised retail price of $199. In the meantime, the release date in the USA was slowly but surely pushed back. Initially, Katana was supposed to be released at Christmas '98 in the USA, then March '99 was announced, followed shortly by April '99, before the console was finally postponed to September '99. However, Bernie Stolar had great ambitions. He planned a $100 million marketing campaign for 2001 and expressed intentions to secure and surpass 50% of the North American video game market, thereby reclaiming Sega's lost market shares. By spring '98, dev kits were sent to selected developers, with the hardware receiving high praise. Many publishers expressed great interest in the console at that time, surprisingly including Electronic Arts, who at that point had plans to bring games to the system. On May 21st, 1998, Katana was first revealed to the world as the Sega Dreamcast, at a press conference during the Sega New Challenge conference. The intention was to release the system in November '98 in Japan. The name Dreamcast for the console was selected from a pool of 5,000 ideas collected by the marketing company Interbrand. Sega's strategy for the Japanese market was unusual. The Sega Dreamcast was intended to run alongside the Sega Saturn and primarily offer titles, while games with better graphics would continue to be distributed on the Sega Saturn. However, this tactic faced resistance, as many Japanese developers reacted to the early announcement of the Sega Dreamcast. They viewed the release as unnecessary, especially since the Saturn was still selling very well in Japan. In the West, however, the new console was received with a great deal of enthusiasm. The entire event was led by Sega's president, Shoichiro Eremajiri, who outlined the capabilities of the console, its final design, and the release date in Japan in November '98. A large part of the presentation focused on hardware, with representatives from NEC, Videologic, Yamaha, and Hitachi revealing details on stage. Bill Gates from Microsoft also addressed the audience with a pre-recorded message, and the hardware could truly hold its own against the competition. Neither the N nor the PlayStation could produce graphics on the screen like those that Sega showcased to the press. All of this was made possible with the well-known SH CPU from Hitachi, which operated at a clock speed of 200 MHz and was, according to Sega, comparable to a 1 GHz Pentium 3 processor. The main memory consisted of 16 BSD RAM, while the GPU was powered by the well-known Power A chip from NEC, capable of rendering 100 megapixels per second. 8 megabits of graphics memory allowed for the rendering of 5 to 7 million polygons, which was simply sensational by the end of 1998 and also looked fantastic at a resolution of 640 x 480 pixels. Games were, as already known, delivered on the 1 GB large GD-ROMs produced by Yamaha. Yamaha also supplied the sound chip for the Sega Dreamcast, which could deliver crystal-clear stereo sound with 64 channels. When considering the included modem, Sega was operating at an extremely high level in 1998 and claimed that the Sega Dreamcast was more than future-proof, even though the emerging DVD technology was overlooked for cost reasons. A fatal mistake, as the future would show. In addition to the console, the controller and the storage medium were also presented. The Dreamcast controller was heavily inspired by the D-controller pad of the Sega Saturn, which was offered at the time with Nights into Dreams. An analog stick was located above the D-pad on the left, while 4 face buttons were found on the right. Additionally, there were two analog shoulder buttons that could be operated above. The controller cable hung unconventionally from the bottom of the controller and could be secured above. Inspired by the N controller, the new control element of the Sega Dreamcast featured two ports for additional peripherals such as a memory card or a rumble pack. The memory card was called VMU, Visual Memory Unit, and featured its own display, a D-pad and face buttons. In addition to the ability to save game data on the VMU, smaller mini-games could also be played on the memory card, saved data could be transferred, and important information could be displayed on the small screen. The most well-known feature of the VMU is related to Sonic Adventure, where players could manage the garden on the VMU. Aside from the practical purpose of storage, it was already evident how innovative the Sega Dreamcast was. When it came to games, the press, aside from brief glimpses of Sonic Adventure and Virtua Striker, was shown only two tech demos, including Erisang and Tower of Babel. The Sega New Challenge Conference was just the beginning of a major marketing offensive in 1998, as the Sega Dreamcast was to be presented to the public at 5 other events before its launch in Japan on November 27th of the same year. Just 6 days after the Sega New Challenge Conference, the E3 took place in the USA, and although the console was not seen on Sega's stage, Bernie Stolar presented the console in bright red with a matching controller and VMU. The CEO of Sega of America confirmed the launch window for the West in 1999 and promised 20 to 30 games at launch. Unfortunately, not a single one of them was shown at E! At the Game Fair, Sega focused on the Sega Saturn, which at that time, unfortunately, no one was interested in anymore. Rather, it was Microsoft that brought the console to its own Windows World Expo in Tokyo in early July. The US company spoke at the 4-day expo about the adapted Windows CE version that was programmed for the console. Visitors were able to hold and start the Sega Dreamcast for the first time, even though it was not connected to a television or monitor. The first real gameplay scenes were shown at the Sonic Adventure Conference, which took place on August 22nd. Took place in '98 in Japan and was held entirely for the Blue Hedgehog's characters. In addition to initial impressions of the game, the presentation aimed to illustrate the capabilities of the Sega Dreamcast. It became really interesting for Sega fans when the second Sega New Challenge Conference was held on October 6th, focusing entirely on the final details and games. In addition to accessories such as an arcade stick, a keyboard, or a steering wheel, 11 games were also presented, including highlights from 2001 like Biohazard, Grandia 2, Power Stone, and Sonic Adventure. The graphical presentation of the games impressed fans and the press. The launch was approaching, and Sega had managed to generate significant hype among gamers, even more so in the West than in its own country. The last major event before the launch of the console took place between October 9 and 11 in Japan, the Tokyo Game Show '98. Visitors were able to experience the qualities of the Sega Dreamcast as Sega showcased 19 titles, including highly anticipated games like Blue Stinger, Sega Rally 2, and Witcher Fighter 3. A little more than a month later, it finally happened, and the long-awaited next-gen console launched on November 27th in Japan, and Sega was prepared. Sega's marketing budget for the launch of the Sega Dreamcast was 3 times higher than that for the Sega Saturn, but it was still not expected to go as smoothly as Sega had hoped. In the summer of '98, it became clear that NEC was having difficulties producing PowerVR graphics chips. Sega had originally intended to deliver consoles at launch, but the forecast painted a different picture. Only about units could be produced in time for the launch in November. Sega opened pre-orders for the console on October 20th and collected reservations on the first day. However, President Shiichiro Irimajiri was forced to suspend pre-orders again on October 22nd due to the anticipated shortage. NEC spoke of difficulties with semiconductor processor technology, with rumors suggesting that 1/3 of the chips had defects during production and had to be sorted out. In the end, Sega and NEC were only able to provide a limited number of Sega Dreamcast systems for the launch. Of these, some were reserved for pre-orders, while the rest were distributed among various retailers across the country, most of which were sold out on the day of the launch. At the launch in Japan, 4 titles were available: Julie Pen Pen, Trill Salon, Witcher Fighter TB, along with Dreamcaster, U-Sand, Failstick, and Godzilla Generations. Witcher Fighter was the best-selling launch title, which surprised no one given the popularity of the series in Japan. The predecessors had almost single-handedly supported the Sega Saturn at the time, and Part 3 did not disappoint in this regard either. While Sega recorded a reasonable financial success, the Japanese market turned out to be a disappointment for the Sega Dreamcast. The overwhelming majority of systems and games were pre-ordered weeks and months in advance, and the confusing reservation process frustrated some retailers, who were subsequently forced to turn away customers who had not reserved in advance. Furthermore, a lack of inventory meant that the system was effectively sold out before it even hit the market. During the Christmas season of '98, there were expected shortages as demand exceeded supply. This was because NEC could only produce about 30% of the consoles, which led to Sega's initial forecast of sold units during this period being effectively halved. Additionally, software delays further exacerbated the Sega Dreamcast debacle in Japan. Sega's original plan was to release one game per week over a period of 4 weeks after the launch, starting with Blue Stinger on December 3rd, Geist Force on December 10th, Sonic Adventure on the 17th, and with Evolution incoming, Monaco Grand Prix, and TH Cross Evolution, there are 4 titles, on December 23rd. However, half of these titles were postponed at the last minute, with Blue Stinger pushed to March '99, and Geist Force completely cancelled. The planned launch title Sega Rally 2 was also affected and was postponed to January 14th. Delayed? While Sonic Adventure experienced a 2-week postponement to December 23rd. Biohazard Code Veronica, which was also planned early on, was postponed to fall 1999, which naturally frustrated fans and new buyers. However, there was good news after the launch. About 1 in 3 Sega Dreamcast buyers logged onto the internet using the included Dream Passport service, which far exceeded Sega's expectations. Additionally, Sonic finally made the leap into the third dimension with Sonic Adventure after the Eagle was severely underrepresented on the Sega Saturn. The game was received excellently by fans and the press, and was the major highlight for Sega and all Eagles fans during the Christmas season. When it came to the pure sales figures of the console, Sega miscalculated. The company assumed that the PlayStation 2 would be released at the end of 1999. The goal was to attract as many developers as possible within a year to position the Sega Dreamcast at the forefront of the 6th console generation. However, this plan did not succeed due to delivery difficulties and numerous software delays, which among other things led to Sega not reaching their projected sales figures of 1 million consoles by March 1999. Following the ongoing trend, Sega Dreamcast releases were sparse in the first half of 1999, and when Sony officially introduced the PlayStation 2 in March 1999, software and hardware sales continued to plummet. In early June, Sega held the Sega New Challenge Conference '99 and lowered the price of the console to yen. As a result, sales in Japan skyrocketed by an astonishing % and Sega Dreamcast consoles were sold out in just 4 days. Unfortunately, this trend did not last long. Many Japanese people no longer trusted Sega, and the introduction of the PlayStation 2 caused many to set aside their hard-earned money. The downward trend in Japan could not be countered even by the 156 games that were released in 1999 in Japan. Starting with Sega Rally 2 in January, the first role-playing game for the console, Evolution, followed in the same month. The highlight of February was certainly Power Stone, while in March the next fighting game hit, Marvel vs. Capcom, was set to follow after Virtua Fighter 3. Throughout the year, more hits were released, such as Tokyo Extreme Racer, Soul Calibur, and Bangai-O, with the last major blockbuster being released on December 29, 1999. On this day, the long-awaited Shenmue by Yu Suzuki was released and revolutionized the gaming industry in one fell swoop. After Zelda Ocarina of Time, which caused a stir at the end of 1998, there was no other game that excited fans and the press as much as the open-world role-playing game. It was the most expensive video game production to date and set new standards in areas such as game world, interaction, and storytelling. Sega attempted to create a balance in its game library between phenomenal arcade adaptations and new developments, with the Sega Dreamcast once again being said to have a large portion of its games originating from arcades and merely being ported. In 2001, we leave the Japanese market and turn our attention to the West, as the Sega Dreamcast was also set to be released in the West in 1999. So make sure to stay tuned as we take a closer look at the launch in the USA after a short commercial break. I hope you enjoy my current retrospective on the Sega Dreamcast. I'm being a bit cheeky and wanted to take the opportunity to do a little self-promotion. If you enjoy my channel, the work behind it, and all the videos, please consider subscribing to me. Because, unfortunately, 70% of all my viewers are not subscribers, and I would like to change that in the future. I have big plans for this channel. I definitely want to reach the subscriber goal this year, and I can only achieve that with your help. So if you enjoy watching my videos and like what I'm doing here, please continue to like and comment actively as the algorithm appreciates that. But as mentioned, please consider subscribing to my channel. Only together with you can I achieve this goal. And now, together with all of you, I can achieve much more here than what we have all already accomplished. So that's it from me, and now let's continue with the second half of my big Sega Dreamcast retrospective. Have fun and see you soon. As was common with console launches at the time, Sega never intended to release the Sega Dreamcast in all markets simultaneously. Instead, Sega fans in the United States had to wait 10 months to finally get their hands on it. The US launch was set by Sega of America for September 9, 1999, making it perhaps the most famous console launch date of all time. Shuichiro Irimajire justified the delayed release in the US by stating that they wanted to support the US market with a larger selection of games. While only 4 launch games were released in Japan, there were to be 19 games in the USA. Until then, there had been little extensive reporting, which was attributed to the modest sales figures in the land of the rising sun. According to reports, Western developers were only provided with the first Sega Dreamcast dev kits in February 1999, which of course caused additional unrest. Sega generated a lot of hype at E3 1999, which took place in May of that year in Los Angeles. Sega of America was present with a plethora of games that were set to be released at the launch of the console, and in the following months, titles like Metropolis, Street Racer, Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, and many others made it so that Sega fans could hardly wait for September 9, 1999. Sega capitalized on the hype and launched the It's Thinking advertising campaign in the summer, which was broadcast on television until the launch of the console. Dreamcast pre-orders in the US were impressive, amounting to double or even triple the pre-orders at the launch of the first PlayStation in 1995. Sega leveraged the strong numbers and referred to the Sega Dreamcast as the most anticipated video game console in history. The nearly 1-year delay of the console in the West also brought some advantages. Games like Blue Stinger and Sonic Adventure were improved for the Western release, and minor bugs were fixed, while other titles such as the Japan-flopped Godzilla Generations were not released at all in the US. Among the 19 launch titles were many high-profile games such as Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Soul Calibur, and Hydro Thunder, but NFL 2K, Sega's own sports game, also received very good ratings and clearly demonstrated that they could manage without EA's sports games. However, just before the launch, a report caused puzzled expressions when it became known that Sega of America would part ways with CEO Bernie Stolar. Stolar had succeeded Tom Kalinske and had played a significant role in the launch of the Sega Dreamcast. However, various disagreements led to Stolar leaving the company just over a month before the launch of the Sega Dreamcast. Peter Moore, who was hired by Stolar at Sega of America and originally came from Electronic Arts to Sega, succeeded Stolar as the CEO of Sega of America and was set to significantly influence the company. Fortunately, the departure of the launch team did not harm the actual start of the console. Sega achieved tremendous success with the Sega Dreamcast console and the 19-strong launch games. All Toys R Us locations were sold out by 1 p.m. Sega sold consoles in the first 2 weeks almost entirely within the first 4 days. Over 1 million consoles were sold in North America in just over 2.5 months, which meant that the Sega Dreamcast was the fastest-selling video game console of all time in America up to that point. Typically, buyers also took home 3 games, which created an outstanding ratio, and brought Sega the success it had hoped for in Japan. The impressive sales figures prompted Sega to adjust their sales forecast for the USA. Bernie Stolar originally set a target of 1.5 million units for March 31, 2000, the end of the fiscal year. This goal was moved up to December 31, 1999, and a new target of 2 million was set for March 31. And indeed, by March 31, 2000, and thus the end of the fiscal year, Sega was able to sell around 2.5 million Sega Dreamcasts, and shine with approximately 14 million games sold. Within 5 months of the launch, Sega held approximately 20% of the US video game market, putting it on the path to regaining its former strength. The launch of the console in Europe was not quite as successful, but still fairly decent, when Sega released the Sega Dreamcast on October 14, 1999. With 10 games in tow, including titles like Sonic Adventure, Sega Rally 2, and Virtua Fighter TB, Sega was able to achieve the most success in the UK. As for Germany, Sega predicted sales figures in Europe between 80. But unfortunately, the German consumers were not as willing to invest money in Sega's new system. Only a few consoles sold in the first weeks. Whether this was due to the relatively high selling price of 199 DM, the limited game selection, or Sega's poor image following the Saturn disaster, we can only speculate today. In other European countries, Sega fans were more willing to buy, resulting in proud sales figures reported by Sega of Europe by the end of 1999. All in all, 1999 was a very successful year for Sega. Although the Sega Dreamcast struggled in Japan, things could not have gone better for Sega in the West. A powerful console, good marketing, online capabilities, and a strong game lineup led to exceptionally good sales figures, allowing Sega to conclude the fiscal year 99 in March 2000 with a positive outlook. In March, the highly anticipated PlayStation 2 was launched in Japan, marking the beginning of the end for the Sega Dreamcast and Sega as a console manufacturer. On March 4th, 2000, Sony released the PlayStation 2 in Japan, which was akin to a dagger blow. Sales of the Sega Dreamcast plummeted almost immediately. In addition to the strong marketing offensive that Sony had launched by the end of 1999, the built-in DVD player was a major reason for many consumers to make a purchase. Back then, DVD players were very expensive, and it was cheaper to get a PlayStation 2, which combined a console and a DVD player. At the same time in Japan, a real DVD boom started. DVD movies were offered for sale everywhere. Video rental stores and retailers used Sony's PS to showcase films, which of course generated significant publicity even outside of video game stores. The launch of the PlayStation 2 dampened Sega Dreamcast sales not only in Japan but worldwide, as customers in the West were eagerly anticipating it and saving their money for the PlayStation 2. In August 2000, rumors began circulating in the US that retailers like Walmart would no longer stock the Sega Dreamcast because space was needed for the upcoming launch of the PlayStation 2. When the PS launched in the US in October, it was significantly more expensive than the Sega Dreamcast and also offered considerably weaker games. Nevertheless, it broke all records. Sega did respond at the end of August to the impending launch of the competing console by lowering the price of the Sega Dreamcast. However, aside from a brief increase in sales, the measure unfortunately brought very little. Sega did not want to make it easy for Sony. By March 2001, they aimed to sell 4.5 to 5 million Sega Dreamcast consoles to stand up to Sony. The mentioned number of sold Sega Dreamcast consoles in 2001 was not just pulled out of thin air. According to Peter Moore, Sega needed to sell 5 million systems to reach the break-even point and finally make the Sega Dreamcast profitable. Delivery problems that plagued Sony during the Christmas season of 2000 played into Sega's hands. PS consoles were scarce and were being offered on various auction sites for up to $800, which is why Sega took advantage of this situation. They aimed to cater to dissatisfied consumers who opted for the more affordable Sega Dreamcast. By December 2000, Sega had only sold units, resulting in a market share of just 15%, while Sony was able to boast a proud 47% market share with their two systems by the end of 2000. Unfortunately, the situation in Europe was not much different. By March 31, 2000, a total of 1.4 million consoles and around 3.9 million games were sold across Europe. Sega faced significant difficulties in delivering software to the player base. Very rarely did a Sega Dreamcast game make it into the weekly top 20 sales charts, and while especially Sega's own first-party games were celebrated by the press, no title became a commercial success. At that time, consumers in Europe were largely divided into two camps. They were either Sony or Nintendo fanboys. Sega's Saturn had generated so much discontent and disappointment that the Sega Dreamcast had to live with the consequences caused by its predecessor. On September 8, 2000, Sega of Europe lowered the price in the UK to $149.99 in response to the launch of the PlayStation 2. Unfortunately, the scenario known from the US repeated itself. Despite delays, hardware shortages, a higher price, and a limited selection of launch software, Sony's machines sold significantly faster and more frequently over the counters of European retailers. In just a few weeks, Sony was able to surpass the sales figures of the Sega Dreamcast with the PlayStation 2, whether in Japan, the USA, or Europe. Sega had been on the decline with the Sega Dreamcast since the launch of the PS, despite the fact that 256 mostly strong games were released that year, including hits like Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, Dead or Alive 2, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Metropolis Street Racer, Resident Evil, Code Veronica, Skies of Arcadia, or Virtua Tennis. In Japan, a true MMORPG, Phantasy Star Online, launched in December 2000, allowing players to complete quests together online. Overall, the year 2000 was considered the best gaming year in the short life of the Sega Dreamcast, which pleased fans and owners of the console, but unfortunately did not contribute much to attracting more buyers. However, a lot more happened in 2000, which I would like to address now, as the events I'm about to describe would significantly contribute to Sega's departure from the hardware business. In May of that year, Isao Okawa replaced Shuichiro Irimajire as president of Sega of Japan. Haya Unakayama, who was the chairman during Sega's rise, was already out, and Okawa lacked confidence in Sega as a hardware manufacturer. As early as 1999, Okawa claimed that the Sega Dreamcast was Sega's last console. Okawa shared from the beginning the vision of Sega as a third-party software provider for other systems and wanted to advance this direction within the company. In the last months of the year 2000, Sega began to make statements about their desire to release their games on platforms that were not from Sega, such as portable PDAs, mobile phones, Bandai's WonderSwan, or Nintendo's soon-to-be-released Game Boy Advance. Rumors about PlayStation 2 ports of Crazy Taxi and Seaman emerged and were attributed to Okawa's promotion, but were vehemently denied by Sega of America at E3 2000, with Charles Belfield, who was then vice president of marketing, clarifying that Sega had no plans to support other home consoles. In September, this was discussed at the highest level when the leadership of Sega met. Alongside Okawa, Peter Moore and Gina Charles Belfield reinforced the idea of making Sega a third-party publisher. Only in this way, according to the statements of the three gentlemen, could the company continue to exist in the industry. Former CEO Bernie Stola had previously expressed the idea of selling Sega to Microsoft and turning the company into a first-party studio for the Xbox. There were even discussions with Microsoft because Sega had offered that Sega Dreamcast games should run natively on the upcoming Xbox. However, all of this was rejected by Microsoft, and so during this meeting on a September day in the year 2000, the fate of the Sega Dreamcast and the future of Sega was sealed. In the fiercely competitive market for game consoles, the Japanese Sega has apparently raised the white flag. Instead of promoting its own Dreamcast console, Sega now wants to produce software for the competition. At least that is what Japanese news agencies report. As it had to happen, the year 2001 began for all Sega fans with a shocking message. As Sega announced on the 31st of January, the discontinuation of the Dreamcast after the 31st of March and the restructuring of the company as a platform-independent third-party developer. At the same time, the price of the Dreamcast was lowered to $99, which was solely intended to clear out the full inventory. This news shook the gaming world and was akin to an earthquake in the industry. Sega was one of the major players, a pillar of the entire industry, and in an instant this support collapsed. After 2 decades as a console manufacturer, the Dreamcast was to become Sega's last home console ever produced. In 2001, tears were shed worldwide, but the news also had its supporters. Many were looking forward to seeing Sonic and other Sega characters on other systems. In the following months, more and more information was to be revealed and exclusive deals announced. Thus, all remaining console manufacturers received a piece of the pie, with Microsoft and Nintendo set to receive the majority of exclusive Sega games. Okawa, who had led Sega through this immense process and had previously lent the company $500 million in the summer of 1999, passed away shortly thereafter on March 16, 2001. Shortly before his death, he forgave Sega's debts and returned his shares of Sega worth $695 million to help the company financially manage the transition to a third-party publisher. Without Okawa and his foresight, it is quite likely that Sega would not exist at all today. So we can all be glad and thank Okawa for saving Sega from financial ruin. Sega's final figures for the Dreamcast, published at the end of the fiscal year on the 31st of March. In 2001, it was stated that at that time, 8.2 million Dreamcast consoles had been sold. In total, the company was able to sell nearly 52 million games between November 98 and March 2001, with additional remaining inventory of consoles and numerous sold games in the following months. New titles continued to be released until 2007, with the majority, as was the case with the Saturn, launching in Japan. In the year 2001 alone, 142 new games were released, including Crazy Taxi 2, Headhunter Raz, Sonic Adventure, and Shenmue 2. In 2002, there were still 48 new games released, while 2003 only saw 28 titles, and the number of new releases continued to decline in the following years. In 2007, the last two officially licensed games by Sega Karos and Trigger Heart Exilia were released. At this point, I would like to mention that the supply of software did not cease, as Sega's last console still enjoys a very active community to this day. Unlicensed Dreamcast games continue to be released, keeping the Dreamcast alive even 20 years after the official stop. When including the software sales, which were reported worldwide after Sega's last business report as a console manufacturer in March. By the end of 2001, the total sales figures for the Dreamcast amounted to 9.13 million. What remains today, over 20 years after the official end of the Dreamcast, is the already mentioned community and a steadily growing group of gamers who have rediscovered the console and then wonder how such an amazing system could flop so hard. And indeed, this topic continues to invite discussions to this day. The reasons for the failure of the Dreamcast are manifold. Of course, the PlayStation 2 plays a role, but it was not solely responsible for sealing the fate of the Dreamcast. Sega managed to do that all on its own over many years. Starting with the aimless releases of various Mega Drive add-ons through the failed Saturn console, to serious missteps in the development of the Dreamcast, there was always something that made the end for the Dreamcast and Sega's exit as a console manufacturer foreseeable. The Mega CD and the 32X, along with the Saturn, significantly damaged Sega's image, especially in the West. Fans and consumers had lost all trust in the company, which of course had cost Sega a lot of money. Even a great console like the Dreamcast was not enough to make up for what had gone wrong in the many years before. Moreover, during the development, they had greatly miscalculated one thing and underestimated the DVD hype. If the Dreamcast had offered a DVD drive from the beginning, things might have turned out very differently for Sega. There was indeed a plan for an external DVD drive, but unfortunately, aside from an appearance at an E, this project never made it to market. During the height of Dreamcast, Sega lost $200 on every console sold. One doesn't need to be a mathematician to calculate what this meant for the company. If it hadn't been for Okawa, Sega would likely have crashed and could have joined companies like Acclaim or Midway at the beginning of the 2001. As tragic as the fate of the Dreamcast is, we can be glad that Sega was able to successfully make the turnaround and survive as a third-party publisher. As for the Dreamcast, it is rightly held in high regard to this day. The system heralded a completely new generation of consoles in '98, offered online gaming when others were still playing in split screen, and revolutionized gaming not just once with its titles. It's no wonder that the console and its games are still held in such high regard today. Even though the games may not measure up to the PlayStation 2, it is the quality of the game library that can impress here. Personally, I like the Dreamcast the most out of all Sega consoles by far, and my experiences with Sonic Adventure 2, Shenmue, or Skysurf Arcadia are among the most beautiful memories of my gaming life. I thank Sega for wanting to get it right with the Dreamcast and for having so much trust in the console. It didn't work out financially, but one thing Sega achieved with the Dreamcast is that they wrote a piece of history that has captured our hearts and that we will never forget. Thank you, Sega. And now it's your turn. I want to see your memories and favorite gaming moments with the Sega Dreamcast and its games. So write in the comments what you associate with the console and how you felt at the time when it was announced that Sega was withdrawing from the console business. Once again, the creation of this documentary involved a lot of work, so I hope you enjoyed the video. If that is the case, I would appreciate your support in the form of a like and a subscription. Feel free to share the video with your friends and other Dreamcast enthusiasts so that it gets even more attention.